I think to some extent, this concern around this risk of going into conflict, military conflict, economic conflict on all fronts, which is the risk scenario we're looking at. We often think about sanctions as the alternative to sort of using military tools. In this case, I think you could see them hand in hand. Um, is sort of what happens to those critical supply chains. And as maybe focus the mind of saying, well, how do we deal with this short-term issue? But I think you rightly highlight this question mark of, well, do short-term measures this year, where does that fit in with these longer-term goals around the energy transition? We know that among the things Russia is unhappy about, and there's a long list, are the fact that European banks won't greenlight financing of European energy projects on environmental grounds, not just anything relating to the system. It's much harder to get funding for projects in Russia's northeast. That Europe wants to stop drilling in the Arctic. Even countries like Norway are not quite so on board with that, but the EU. Russia is worried about CBAM, the border adjustment mechanism. So there's a number of kind of issues and different sort of economic models that I think are at stake here. But I'm sorry, and I've sidestepped your question of how much willingness. I think that part of this trying to focus and crystallize attention on where additional supplies might be is a part of this effort the US is doing to try to keep the alliance together, try to make sure that they're not fissures that Putin can take advantage of. He, along with Xi Jinping and Chinese leaders, are very good at playing those fissures and widening them. But I think ultimately what we'll see in any sanctions package will not be anything that directly targets energy supplies. It's probably more a risk from a counter-sanction side. And then the other thing is, if there's a risk of military conflict, there's a lot of different scenarios that could impact energy supplies and pipelines, but also grain supplies. Ukraine and Russia are big suppliers of grain. Russia already stopped exporting as much because they had a poor harvest. So actually, Ukraine's been benefiting in the short term, but there are important supplies here that could exacerbate some of the doorstep issues you guys are looking at, right? This has already been a year where food prices are rising. There are fertilizer challenges that come from having big sanctions on Belarus. There are other issues where high energy prices in Europe mean that fertilizer plants aren't operating because they're really energy intensive. There's a lot of different pieces. And let's not forget that some of the biggest buyers of Eurasian grain are in the Middle East, Turkey, Egypt, and I don't want to sort of overstate the risks, but let's also not forget that the Arab Spring came after a year where food prices rose rapidly, in part because of poor harvests and export controls of grain from Russia. So there are a lot of sort of potentially challenging issues. One of the reasons that this agriculture issue is one of the reasons why agriculture is not one of the sectors that is on this sort of target list. And if anything, I think the worries about the impact on the doorstep for Europeans, for Americans, for kind of global consumers has been why the US government's pivoted more towards trying to use export controls and not just what we think of as financial sanctions. So they're likely to target banks, but this thinking about cutting off supply of electronics, of software. Russian companies have been under orders to use more domestically made software. State-owned enterprises have not done a great job applying that. Import substitution is hard and it's costly. But in a sense, I see that in part as the US effort to look around and say, well, what's the asymmetric power we have now? We've used some of the asymmetric power over 2014 or since 2014 and 2015. And so and then Russia has adjusted to some of those measures. We might look and say, okay, well, they're choosing not to grow, that's a cost, but that is a choice that they're making. So I do see this push towards export controls as being that attempt to try to say, well, what are the things that might hit Russian, sort of doorstep issues and not. But as I think a number of people have rightly highlighted, things like export controls, they're more sort of longer term sort of structural issues. And we've seen Chinese companies adjust to some of those sort of controls. I might say Russian would have a harder time doing that than a Huawei or a Chinese industrial complex, but their limitations and their costs to all these tools, including to sort of global trade and the like.